Welcome, greetings. I'm Claudio Lomnitz. Welcome to the Anthropology Department and to the Disappearance and Governmentality conference. You'll notice that we're on sort of standard anthropology time, which is you have to subtract an hour, add 2 minutes, that kind of thing. Please don't mind the clock. I wanted to take these first few minutes to talk a little bit about the Social Study of Disappearance Lab, which is the unit that's sponsoring this event. The lab is housed here in the Anthropology Department, and it was inaugurated a little over a year ago, in November of the last academic year, with a conference on disappearance in Mexico. The idea of the lab was initial idea was to supplement the work that we do in a course that I've been teaching for the last 3 years called the Mexico's Disappearance Practicum, and to build a kind of a research and public outreach arm for this work, asking conceptual, empirical, and comparative questions like those that will be raised and addressed today in our proceedings today. This is our second year then of existence, and thanks to the efforts of Emily Hoffman, whom you'll hear from in a minute, and myself, we were able to secure funding for this project from 3 Columbia University sources, which are ISERP, that has a program to fund new centers and new initiatives like this one, Insight, which is an initiative that has to do with socially relevant social science research, and the Center for Political Economy, a new center here at Columbia, which was actually our original funder. The first year conference we did thanks to the Center for Political Economy and the Institute for Latin American Studies. Thanks to these 3 sources and to the real tireless efforts that you've all witnessed today of our Assistant Director, Maria Sabater, present there, we now have a website, and I'm sorry to sort of strut and peacock this kind of thing, but to me, I mean, this is like major thing because I'm completely incapable of doing any of it, and Maria was put together a website which I think is quite nice, and please visit it, and as well as, even for today's event, a YouTube channel, which is even more impressive, and that's what these mics are for the transmission of events such as today's, today's event is being live streamed, and it will later be sort of parceled into more digestible bits and put onto our YouTube channel. If you want to be on the mailing list for the lab's events, please write to us through our website, because we also have a mailing address. So did want to mention everything like that. This year we have, in addition to this event, which is its signal and major event of the year, a one-day conference on disappearances in Syria planned for the end of March. So stay tuned. We'll be letting everyone know about that as soon as the program is finalized. We also host 2 small research working groups, one that works on what they call lawyers call context analysis for disappearance, lawyers and forensic people, and another one that is just starting on the question of counting disappearances and undercounting disappearance, specifically in Mexico. Finally, we do host occasionally speakers, and yesterday, for instance, in the afternoon, we hosted Marcela Turati, who is not in the room right now, but will be here. She's somewhere in the building. A discussion on Marcela Turati's remarkable book on the massacres of San Fernando in Tamaulipas, not far from the U.S.-Mexican border. So that's what the, sorry, you can't hear me? I keep thinking that this mic will do the trick. So that's what the lab is. That's what is sponsoring this. And I want to say one or two words about the mechanics of the event, then briefly introduce our first speaker who's going to launch the mission of the program, Emily Hoffman. So mechanics simply are, we're going to have a set of sessions with 3 speakers. Each, the presentations will be around 20 minutes, and that should give us not too much time, but maybe 40 minutes after the end of each session for questions and discussion. We are going to have to keep more or less to the clock because we have a full day of work ahead. Okay, and I'm going to be moderating, and Emily will be moderating these different sessions. So Emily Hoffman, Maria and I are sort of organizing members of the lab, and Emily Hoffman is an advanced PhD student in our department here at Columbia. She's writing a really quite stunning work on childhood, adoption, foster care, the legal space in which contentions around around abuse and around a state protection, state intervention, family structure has developed. And so that's the work that she's been doing now and that she's currently doing, but she's also quite a remarkable and highly regarded poet, and someone who's had a career in the arts before moving into anthropology, including in the theater. So we're really proud to have her here. And Emily.
Well, I want to just thank everybody for joining us today, our panelists and our audience. I want to echo Claudio's praise for Maria, who we could not do without. And also to thank Claudio for inviting me into the lab so graciously and giving me such ample space to learn and to think out loud as I'm learning. So I've just, what I'm going to read is just a sort of fleshing out of some of the conceptual terrain that gives rise to this solicitation to speak about enforced disappearance and governmentality. Some observations, mostly a lot of questions that I hope will provide some kind of capacious conceptual weave for us to be situated within today. Can everyone hear me okay? Yeah, okay. Louder. All right. So, when governments refer to disappearance, they speak in the idiom of sight. The disappeared person is removed from view. From what perspective or perspectives is sight occluded? And a second question, what comes into view when we choose to name, identify, and focus on disappearance as a social phenomenon across disparate contexts? The disappeared person is, of course, removed from the presence of his or her kin and larger circle of relations. These kin are the ones who often work to produce a counter-presence, to make present the absence. In Mexico, for instance, the colectivos search for their loved ones and occupy public space with photos of the disappeared. For them, the disappearance is an open wound, loss without closure. But a different set of questions emerge when we think about the implications of disappearance for the state. Under international law, according to UN Convention, enforced disappearance is considered to be the arrest, detention, abduction, or any other form of deprivation of liberty by agents of the state, or by persons or groups of persons acting with the authorization, support, or acquiescence of the state, followed by a refusal to acknowledge the deprivation of liberty, or by concealment of the fate or whereabouts of the disappeared person, which place such a person outside the protection of the law. That's the text of the convention. I think there are two things for us to highlight in this definition for our purposes today. The first, the status of state acquiescence, and the second, this claim that the disappeared person is outside of the space of the law, or at least outside of the law's protection. Is the disappeared person subtracted from the population of the governed? And how will we want to conceptualize recurrent or new forms of state power that function through this kind of acquiescence, exposure of populations to a violence not directed by or under control of the state? Though the paradigmatic examples of enforced disappearance include the disappearance of political dissidents during the Cold War and the so-called Dirty Wars, increasingly enforced disappearance takes place not directly, and certainly not exclusively by state action, but instead by state acquiescence or connivance. Indeed, disappearance puts pressure on the fiction of the state as a monolithic or coherent entity and pushes us to ask empirical questions about the functioning of different state forms. This may be one of those things that disappearance brings into view. Today, the state often exercises a prerogative of not looking, not seeing, selective blindness, either to conspire in disappearance or at least to preserve the fiction that it retains control over the population. This is at least the case in Mexico, where over 100,000 people have been forcibly disappeared over the past 15 years or so, driven by organized crime and with the support or acquiescence of state actors. Mexico's Subsecretary of Human Rights has called the country an enormous clandestine grave. The police don't investigate, prosecutors regularly open but almost never close cases. There is a pervasive forensic breakdown and a chronic undercounting in the official registry of disappeared persons. Often this is purposeful state incapacity, manifest in underfunding and in lack of political will to prioritize the enforcement of security as a public good. Sometimes the government's part in disappearances escapes the will of its chief executives and can be chalked up to the corruption or coercion of specific players or simply to lack of specialized training in civil service. Do we want to see this as a breakdown of state power? If instead we want to understand state acquiescence, the state acquiescence at play across these different levels as a form of state power, how can we conceptualize this power that operates by ignorance? Is there a power ignorance to be contended with? Foucault, of course, makes very clear that the state is neither monolith nor unity. As he says in The Birth of Biopolitics, the state has no heart, as we well know, but not just in the sense that it has no feelings, either good or bad, but it has no heart in the sense that it has no interior. The state is nothing else but the mobile effects of a regime of multiple governmentalities. And he accuses in those lectures both neoliberal thinkers and left critics of the state of what he calls an anti-statism or a state phobia that makes the mistake of overvaluing or over-attributing power to the state. He uses an economic metaphor there, calling this critique of the state inflationary, both in the sense that it imagines a limitless capacity on the part of the state for expansion and conquest of its other, civil society, and also in its tendency to run together different forms of the state as if they were one and the same thing, or as if they could merge into one another. Those critics in the grips of what Foucault calls the great fantasy of the paranoiac and devouring state, he says, make the mistake of running state forms together, beginning by analyzing the administrative state and social security, say, and ending up speaking of concentration camps. Nevertheless, and in spite of these warnings, I think that the place of the Nazi state within Foucault's development of the concept of biopower in society must be defended as the apotheosis of a certain biopolitical form, coupled with the generalization of the old sovereign right to kill, may have the effect of skewing the concept of governmentality in its tone and habitual associations towards certain state forms or functions. There may be an over-association between state violence and an expectation of total vision, of meticulous record keeping that may not be generalizable or may not serve us as we think about enforced disappearance and its relation to state power. Achille Mbembe's original conceptualization of necropower or necropolitics in his 2003 essay in Public Culture addresses a certain imbalance of tone and emphasis in Foucault's conceptualization of biopower. If biopower names the domain of life over which power has taken control, Mbembe turns our attention to the make-die component of the formulation of sovereign right to let live and make die, and to a lesser extent to the let die half of the biopolitical formulation of sovereignty to make live and let die. To the topographies of death, Mbembe adds to the concentration camp, the plantation, the colony, and the apartheid regime. His emblematic example of the necropolitical, what he calls the most accomplished form of necropower, is the contemporary occupation of Palestine. In this context, surveillance is central, and Mbembe quotes A.L. Weitzman's description of settlements as urban optical devices for surveillance and the exercise of power. As Mbembe writes, under conditions of late modern colonial occupation, surveillance is both inward and outward oriented, the eye acting as a weapon and vice versa. Mbembe's inversion, or really extension of the concept of the biopolitical into the necropolitical, at least in this early articulation, retains the Foucauldian focus on a certain strong state form that exercises extreme control over territory and population through pervasive surveillance, limitation of movement, etc. This is not to say that Mbembe doesn't gesture at situations of more fractured sovereignty in his first introduction of the necropolitical. He does briefly discuss the situation of many African states in the last quarter of the 20th century. In this context, he names the erosion of the monopoly on violence and the means of coercion, describing the transformation of coercion into a market commodity. Urban militias, private armies, armies of regional lords, private security firms, and state armies are all parties he names who claim the right to exercise violence or to kill. Still, if we want to understand how to characterize the role of state acquiescence in enforced disappearance, the exposure of populations to violence without recourse to the protection of the law, it may be more useful to think in terms of organized abandonment. I'm thinking here within anthropology of Beth Pavanelli and João Bill, but I'm thinking most of all with the work of geographer Ruth Wilson Gilmore and her now classic definition of racism as the state-sanctioned or extra-legal production and exploitation of group-differentiated vulnerability to premature death. That definition of racism of Gilmore's is key to her analysis of racial capitalism, and so also brings into view the very important question of economy in connection to what we're talking about here today. In the 2019 book-length discussion of necropolitics, Mbembe focuses much more on contexts of violent resource appropriation in many regions of the post-colonial world, which he writes have increased in complexity, with links appearing between the armed forces, the police, the administering of justice, and criminal milieus. Wherever repression and trafficking of all sorts feed off of one another, a politico-cultural configuration has appeared that grants a large place to the possibility that anyone whomever can be killed by anyone whomever at whatever moment using any pretext at all. He describes a generalized state of war, which is entangled with economy in new ways. Mbembe again. The actors of war are pell-mell, properly constituted states, armed formations acting or not behind the mask of the state, armies without states but that control quite distinct territories, states without armies, corporations or concessionary companies tasked with extracting natural resources but that, moreover, have arrogated to themselves the right to wage war. Regulating the population is done by means of wars that consist, for their part, in processes of appropriating economic resources. In such context, the imbrication of war, terror, and the economy is such that no longer is it merely a matter of a war economy. By creating new military markets, war and terror have transformed into modes of production, period. In connection with that insight, I want to say first that one of the lab's focuses in the next 2 years will be precisely questions of political economy in the context of armed violence, how to think about the imbrication of legal and illegal sectors and dynamics of capital accumulation as they relate to violent conflict. I also want to mention, out of the flurry of executive orders that Trump recently signed, the one that moves to classify cartels as terrorist organizations. In the article where this was reported in the Times, by way of explaining the unusualness of the designation, the reporter reminds the reader that the department typically gives the label terrorist to groups with ideological objectives, while drug cartels and gangs have financial motivations. I think it's worth thinking about those label signifiers, ideological and financial, and their new configuration in this moment. But to return to enforced disappearance, to which of these forms or descriptions of power, of governmental power, the old sovereign power, disciplinary power, biopower, necropower, should we attribute enforced disappearance? Does it open up new questions about the operations of power? Does it mark a failure or a limit? Might we be able to specify something conceptually across contexts about disappearance? Or is the disappearance of a political dissident by the army categorically different from, say, a local government authority allowing a cartel to deposit bodies in a potter's field? In the context of Mexico, Claudio has been working on an analysis of shifting forms of sovereignty illuminated by the disappearance crisis. This involves both an analysis of the shifting form of the state and its more limited sphere of operation, what Claudio has identified as islands of rule of law within a sea of informality and extortion, as well as analysis of the forms of sovereignty enacted by the cartels, what he is elaborating as a political theology of negative sovereignty. As we think about enforced disappearance as something the state does or lets happen, how do we think about demands made on the state in the name of the disappeared? In Mexico, for instance, certain new legal rights have been articulated in relation to disappearance, the right to be searched for being one of them. What kind of right is this, demanded from what kind of state? For those who were here at our recent BOAS seminar, Juan Carlos Mazariegos offered a very provocative and interesting interpretation of that kind of demand, of what he calls our forensic moment. He was speaking about the use of pseudonymity by indigenous guerrilla fighters in the context of the Guatemalan Civil War, and he suggested that the contemporary demand by former combatants that the state identify the remains of victims of the massacres and link those remains to a single individual, to a single name. He suggested that that demand represented the absolute end in that context of the revolutionary moment, which had been marked by a refusal of the indexicality of the proper name. That's, of course, not the only way to read or conceptualize the relationship between the dead, the living, and the state in the context of disappearance. Mbembe also writes about remains. Oftentimes, he writes, the most striking thing is the tension between the petrifaction of bones and their strange coldness on the one hand, and their obstinacy in wanting to signify something at all costs on the other. In other circumstances, no serenity seems to inhabit these bits of bone, marked by impassibility, nothing but the illusory refusal of a death already come. This question of the remnant or the remain brings with it again the question of sight or perspective. Mbembe writes of the coldness of bones and their obstinate desire to signify. But it seems to me that bones do not signify or fail to signify independent of the searcher. This description of the bones may not adequately capture the relation to physical remains of those who search in Mexico, the drive and the social meaning of identifying remains for return and burial. Though we can also ask a question about a social position perhaps closer to the somewhat generalized vantage of Mbembe's rhetoric. That is, a question about the effects of enforced disappearance beyond the circle of kin and intimates on the social as a whole. In Mexico, we see a chilling effect on public discourse, an inability of the issue to gain traction, something like a collective repression. Perhaps we should return to the literature on mourning and melancholia to think about what happens when grieving is barred, when the object's loss cannot be acknowledged, and thus the object is internalized and, together with its unacknowledged loss, permanently installed. What are the new symptoms of the social under these conditions? The final question here would be about the place of an anthropology of disappearance. In the context of the lab, we have discussed both the seduction and impossibility of taking over for the forensic or documentary derelictions of the state. But what modes of anthropology, as record-making, as storytelling, as witness, as form of analysis, can be brought to bear in this context? Hopefully, we might begin to learn some of that today. Thank you.